Okay, so I want to say thank you for attending. I am actually pleased there's so many people here. I may actually have a good problem, which is a problem finding a seat. The Compliance Risk Management Integrity Institute, of which I'm the director, and Theo is the administrative director, are pleased to welcome back CWRU Law alumnus George Scavdis. As former special agent in charge of the FDA Office for Criminal Investigations, George led and managed sophisticated investigations involving complex schemes of pharmaceutical fraud, medical device violations, and other critical public health matters. Today, he is going to share one of his most significant achievements as the lead FDA case agent in the landmark Theranos investigation. Prior to the FDA, George served as special agent for the USAID, the U.S. Secret Service, and for the District of Columbia government. He's now transitioned to the private sector as a principal at the Scavdis Group, which provides expert investigative and consulting skills or services for law firms and life science companies, basically so that they uphold their compliance and ethical obligations. Please join me in welcoming back to the Case Western campus, George Scavdis.
Good afternoon. Consider this scenario. A patient walks into a physician's office or pharmacy to get a blood test. Could be anybody, could be a college student that's going to get tested for HIV, could be a cancer survivor that's being tested to see if their cancer's returned, or it could be a pregnant woman who's getting tested to see if her pregnancy is going at a normal, healthy rate. And the person has their blood drawn, it's packed carefully in dry ice, and then it's FedExed off to what's supposed to be a sophisticated laboratory in California. And the patient expects that qualified medical professionals are going to protect their most valuable medical information. But behind the scenes, what really happened should concern everybody in this room from a compliance, regulatory, and an ethical standpoint. The laboratory director, the person who is legally responsible for overseeing the entire operation, never met with a single laboratory employee in the entire 10 months that he was the laboratory director. That same person whose job is to ensure things like testing validation, quality control, accuracy, never met with one patient or one doctor that used the company's tests. That same laboratory director who had a regulatory obligation to shut down testing if quality standards weren't being met worked a total of 5 to 6 hours in 7 months. Theranos paid this person $5,000 a month to essentially just lend his name to the company for licensing purposes, and that arrangement was not an oversight. That's exactly what Elizabeth Holmes intended. Good afternoon. Thanks for the introduction. As Eric said, I'm George Scavdis, and I spent 6 years of my life as part of a team from the federal government that included prosecutors, paralegals, and agents that investigated and prosecuted Elizabeth Holmes and Sonny Balwani for fraud. I recently retired from the government and started a corporate investigations and consulting firm called the Scavdis Group, and the primary focus is to help life science companies strengthen their ethics and compliance programs so they don't become the next Theranos. But before all that, I was here in this building learning criminal law and contracts and evidence from brilliant professors like Dr. Katz and Dr. Kostritsky and Jim Woolley and the late Jim McElhaney. So to have this be the last place I was before I moved to Washington, D.C. to start my law enforcement career, and then to be back here 3 months after it ended is a really, really nice bookend for me, and I'm really, really to be grateful presenting to you guys today. The first time I was asked to present on Theranos was to the Association of Medical Device Manufacturers in Los Gatos, California last year. And that was a really interesting audience to present to because everybody in that audience was in the regulatory department of a startup in a life sciences company. So as we know, Theranos was a startup life sciences company in Palo Alto. So everybody in that audience either was friends with somebody or worked with somebody that had worked at Theranos. So the topic was really, really personal to them. And at the time, the criminal appeals process was still going on for Holmes and Balwani, and I was still an active agent with the FDA. So I was very reluctant when the organizer, a woman named Michelle Roding, approached me about presenting. So reluctantly I agreed to present, but I told her, you can't use my name in any of the lead-up material. You can't make any reference to the FDA Office of Criminal Investigations. I don't want a name tag. You have to stop all recording devices when I'm in there. It was very cloak and dagger. I was a real pain in the neck about it. But I'll tell you, I was terrified that I was going to stand up at that podium and look out at the audience, and I was going to see some attorney from Williams and Connolly, which was her defense attorney, writing down everything that I said, and it was going to show up in some motion to the court demanding a new trial. Like, that's the amount of paranoia that had been bred into all of us from the media scrutiny and the public notoriety of this case over the years. I'll start by speaking briefly about my own career progression, how specifically I got from law school into law enforcement, and then I'll talk about the investigations and the trials. And given that I am here at the invitation of the Institute of Compliance and Risk Management and Financial Integrity, I challenge you as I'm speaking to think about how an effective ethics and compliance program could have led to a different outcome for Theranos. I say possibly because the cultures of some organizations are so compromised or so rotten from the top that the best intentioned ethics and compliance officer wouldn't be successful, and they'd be destined to fail. And you might decide that that's what happened with Theranos. Raise your hand if you've ever heard the expression that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So whether it's the financial risk inherent in raising hundreds of millions of dollars, or the compliance risk of operating under two very complex regulatory frameworks in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, what are some of the things you would have designed to sort of help prevent, detect, and mitigate risk if you worked at Theranos? Listen for those cues about what the company culture was like. Did it sound like they had a speak-up culture, encouraging people to report misconduct, or did it sound like the opposite? My presentation isn't necessarily going to be wrapped around the 7 elements of an effective ethics and compliance program that's laid out in the federal sentencing guidelines, but the stories I tell will touch on some of that, and I invite you to identify those connections. By the time I was a 3-0 here at Case, I was in the middle of a full-blown career crisis, and I hadn't even started my career yet. I loved law school. I enjoyed all my classes, even the ones I didn't think I would enjoy, like contracts and federal taxation. But I didn't enjoy my summer jobs. My first job was a federal externship in downtown Cleveland with a district court judge. My second summer, I worked at the Lake County Public Defender's Office, and the days just seemed to drag on for me. So I was really kind of at a crossroads. I loved law school. I loved criminal law. I loved criminal procedure. But I think I was looking for a career that had a little more excitement, a little more danger to it, and I found that in law enforcement. So I graduated here from Case, went to Columbus, took and passed the bar exam, moved to Washington, D.C., and started blasting out applications to different law enforcement agencies. And in the meantime, I signed up to work for a temporary staffing agency called the Advantage Temp Agency. And my first assignment with them was to work for a District of Columbia government agency that was responding to a FOIA request from the Wall Street Journal. And so I would go to this agency every day, and I would sit in a conference room, and there'd be boxes of government records stacked on the table. And my job was to pull out the records, and every time I saw a date of birth or a social security number, I took a black marker and just crossed it out. And I did that for months, and I was working alongside two people that were high school graduates, and we were doing the same thing and being paid the same. And I lived in Maryland at the time, so I would take the metro into work. And before I could bring myself to drive to the metro station every morning, I would sit on the edge of my bed with my face in my hands, just debating for 5 minutes if I was going to go to work that day. And I won't go through my chronology because Eric thankfully did that. That'll save a little time. But I eventually did get into law enforcement, starting with the DC government, worked my way through the Secret Service, USAUIG, which unfortunately no longer exists. And then I found a home where I retired with the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations, where I worked for 16 years investigating drug companies, medical device companies, and their executives. Having a law degree is a tremendous advantage as a criminal investigator. And I didn't always realize that when I was in law enforcement. It's certainly not a prerequisite to enter the profession. Most of your peers don't have one. So as a young agent, I think a lot of the time I felt like I was underachieving in a sense that I wasn't using my law degree, and it wasn't until I matured that I understood that I was, one of the things that a law degree gives you is instant credibility with prosecutors. I've never led a relationship with an AUSA or prosecutor by telling them that I was a licensed attorney. And in fact, there's plenty of prosecutors I've worked with over the years that to this day don't know that. But the ones that found out after we started interacting, the differences in the way they spoke with me, the way they included me, and the things they asked me to do was noticeable. For example, there's a couple of things I've been asked to do by AUSAs during federal trials. Draft direct examination outlines for them to use as witnesses during trials. Create the closing PowerPoints for the Holmes and the Balwani trial for them to argue to the jury. The PowerPoint, and you'll see some slides today from that, for the Holmes trial was 309 slides. Those aren't requests that are normally made of agents by prosecutors. The skills that are fundamental to law school graduates, the ability to think logically and analytically, to digest complex material, to write well, those aren't fundamental in my opinion. They're just not. This is 3 years of intense skill building that you have that others don't. Your knowledge of things like evidence, search and seizure law, they're invaluable in helping you inform your day-to-day decisions about how to gather evidence, how to follow the Constitution. You're certainly instructed on those things in law enforcement academies, but not to the depth that you would get in law school, obviously. But most importantly, what I think a law degree gives you is the ability to see around corners. Like, what do I mean by that? We like to say in law enforcement that we're just fact finders. And that is true. During investigation, we find facts that might implicate somebody, we find facts that exculpate somebody, and we consider them all, and then we decide what to do. But it's not as simple as just weighing up a good fact versus a bad fact at the end of the day. And what your law degree helps you do is look at the good facts and then think, okay, how is the defense going to spin this into a bad fact? How are they going to cast doubt on this email? How are they going to cast doubt on this witness? How are they going to rebut this? Because they will, and if they're good attorneys, it'll be compelling. You learn how to do that in law school because you're consistently asked to consider and argue both sides of an issue. So not only does that lead to a more accurate assessment of the strength of your own evidence, it helps you plan your next steps and be proactive and try to stay one step ahead of defense attorneys. All right, what's an additional witness I'm going to need to talk to? What's an additional document I'm going to need to procure to rebut what the defense is going to say? And that's incredibly important when your adversary is spending tens of millions of dollars on their defense and engaging well-resourced law firms, like was the case in Theranos. So I think it was early spring, or late spring, early summer 2016. I was sitting at my office desk in Silver Spring, Maryland, and my phone rang. And on the other line was an attorney from the FDA's Office of Chief Counsel that I'd worked with before in many other investigations. And she said that she was recently at a meeting with FDA, we call it White Oak, it's the main campus in Silver Spring. And they were meeting with a consumer safety officer or a CSO. CSOs are the people within FDA that go out and inspect drug companies, device companies, and manufacturing facilities. She was meeting with the CSO and an attorney from the Department of Justice. And they were talking about a different criminal matter. And at the end of the interview, the CSO turns to them and he says, if you think this is bad, you should look into this company called Theranos. I was just out at their inspection and you wouldn't believe some of the things I saw. So the attorney thinks, oh, I'll call George, this might be something he's interested in. So at the time, Theranos wasn't on my radar. This is late 2016. I wasn't aware of the Wall Street Journal article in 2015 that sort of introduced Theranos to the world and cast doubt on their testing. Shame on me. But I started talking to her more about what the CSO's concerns were, about the behavior of the company during the compliance inspection. I started doing some research into the company and then made a decision to open an investigation criminally. And given the fact that you're all voluntarily here, I'm going to assume some sort of prior level of knowledge when it comes to Theranos, but I'll give you a sort of a quick recap because it's been a little while. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford at age 19, founded a technology startup in Silicon Valley that was eventually valued at over $9 billion, was romantically involved with her COO and co-conspirator, Ramesh Sunny Balwani. She was able to secure $100 million investments in a pot from some of the most wealthy families in America. The Walton family, which owns Walmart. The DeVos family, which is the co-founder of Amway. Rupert Murdoch, owner of Fox News and the Wall Street Journal. And the value proposition that she was selling to investors and doctors and patients was that Theranos had developed a technology that was going to revolutionize healthcare. And this technology was encapsulated in a small device the size of a desktop computer called the Edison. And according to Holmes, the Edison could perform a full range of blood tests, over 1,000 on one single drop of blood. This technology was going to lead to early disease detection. It was going to allow people who were afraid of needles not to have to get intravenous blood draws anymore. And she told investors it would greatly reduce the cost of blood testing, which would lead to higher profit margins for them. In reality, most patients who got a Theranos blood test got an intravenous blood draw, where they would extract tubes and tubes of blood. Only a handful of tests could actually be performed on their device, the Edison, somewhere between 6 and 12, depending on the time period, not the over 1,000 tests that Holmes promised. And in fact, most of the company's tests were actually performed on third-party analyzers that they bought from other companies like Siemens and Advia, a fact which they hid from investors and the public. There were a couple other processes at play during this time that I opened it. The SEC had an ongoing investigation into investor fraud. The U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of California had an open investigation into Theranos. So I joined their investigation, and then that formed the team that investigated Theranos. It was paralegals and AUSAs from San Francisco and San Jose, FBI agents from San Francisco and San Jose, a postal inspection agent from San Francisco, and George Scavdis from Maryland. That was the group. There was some attrition over the years, but that was the core of the team, and we worked that case for 6 years. So just to orient you a little bit, I told you I opened my investigation in late spring, early summer 2016. On October 16th, 2015, the Wall Street Journal, our own investigative journalist named John CWRU, published an article that said, "Hot startup Theranos has struggled with blood testing technology." He also wrote a book about Theranos in 2018, and I'm not ashamed to tell you that I read that book multiple times looking for investigative leads, and I found some. He did a fabulous job. He really did. That article was the first time that it had been revealed to the public that Theranos was actually using third-party devices to run a lot of their tests. And it was also the first time that somebody sort of raised publicly that there were some serious accuracy concerns with the test results. A month after the Wall Street Journal article, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services went in and inspected Theranos' high-complexity laboratory in California, where they used to run their patient blood tests on their proprietary device. This is the lab that I referenced in my opening. And CMS found that the deficient practices of the laboratory were so bad that they posed an immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety, which it turns out shut down their high-complexity lab for good. They never ran another blood test out of that lab after that. 2 months before the Wall Street Journal article, FDA had gone in and inspected their manufacturing facilities in California and found that they were shipping an uncleared Class 2 medical device in interstate commerce. So for FDA, in order to have an authority to regulate a device, a drug, it has to be in interstate commerce. And in this case, they were collecting the blood of patients in their small tube called the nanotainer in Arizona and then flying it to California. That to have it tested. That's what gave FDA the inspection, the authority to go in and inspect the company. So at the point in 2016 when I got involved, the crime is a historic one. The lab has been shut down. They never ran another test out of there. The investors have already invested. Now it's just a matter of determining whether a fraud occurred and then proving it up. So the investigation focused on 2 fraud schemes. There was a scheme to defraud investors and a scheme to defraud patients. And as the FDA agent working for the regulatory body charged with ensuring medical devices are safe and effective, my primary focus was on proving the fraud against the doctors and the patients. So I interviewed all the doctors, all the patients, all the people from the FDA, all the people from CMS. The other part of the team would focus primarily on the investors and former employees. And there's a lot of categories of evidence you try to pull from when you're putting together a criminal case. You have interviews and surveillances and undercover reportings and trash pulls. But in fraud cases, most times it's going to come down to the documents, and Theranos was no different. The e-discovery database that the government favored then and still favors today is something called Relativity. It's a cloud-based database, and it contained every document that was in this case. So every interview report, every document produced by FDA, every document produced according to a subpoena return, all the FDA and CMS documents. By the end of this case, there were 6 million documents in this database. And if anybody has ever used an e-discovery database, these things are not organized in nice folders. Right? There is no folder for the Theranos test results from 2013 or the emails from the lab director about quality control. They're scattered all over the place. So you're always finding new things. If I went in there now, I guarantee you I could find great exhibits that we should have used at trial, which is kind of a scary thought, but it's true. But there's three things that I was chasing in relativity. I'm chasing, how can we prove the tests were inaccurate? How can we prove that Holmes and Balwani knew they were inaccurate? And how can we identify the patients and doctors that received an inaccurate test? So obtaining evidence proving that Holmes and Balwani knew that the tests were inaccurate was not difficult. They had their hands on every facet of that operation. They were on tons of emails talking about them. They were texting each other. That was not difficult. The trickier part was identifying the tests that were inaccurate and then the patients and the doctors that received them so that we could locate and interview them. If you think about a blood test you've received before, you go in, you get a report, and it lists all the tests that you've had done. And there's something on there called a reference range, right? And if your value is above the reference range or below the reference range, it's an indicating that there might be an issue that requires further investigation. But what if you suspect that the accuracy of the test is incorrect? Then how are you supposed to interpret an out of reference range result, right? It could be there is a problem, or it could be just the test is inaccurate. By the same token, if somebody has a test result where everything is within range, does that really mean that there's no problem with the patient, or is the test inaccurate? The point I'm making is you need something else to put that test result in context. You need maybe an email complaint from a doctor or a competing lab test result to compare it to give you an indicator that there might be a problem with that particular test. So that's what I was looking for, because every Theranos test wasn't bad on every single day. Some tests were bad on some days, some tests were fine on some days, some tests were never bad. So that was the tricky part, was sort of putting that together, going into relativity. I was looking for things like email chains from sales reps to maybe their product manager or to the lab director. He's saying something like, so-and-so had a patient that had a bad ECG test, he's very upset, can you follow up? So you sort of chase those things down, and then I would follow back up with the doctor's office, and initially I would call them and say, hey, I need you to send me every patient chart that you have for anybody that had a Theranos blood test, an ECG test, and they would go, well, we don't track where they got their test from. That'd be impossible for us to do unless we manually went through every patient's test result or chart, and we're not going to do that. So then you have to go back into the database and try to find something else to narrow it down. Maybe you'd find some initials of a patient on a complaint log or something, so that you could then send a more targeted subpoena to the business. And so that's what I would do week after week, month after month. Eventually you're getting returns from the doctor's offices, and then you're able to compile a list of possible targets for interview and investigation. And so by doing that, anytime I was able to acquire a list of about 20 or 30 targets for patients and doctors, I would fly out to Arizona, and then 2 AUSAs and an agent would fly out from California. We'd meet together in the lobby of whatever Hampton Inn we were staying in, and I would just divide up my stack of folders, and each folder had the target name, possible addresses, because you don't know for sure somebody lives where the internet says they live, possible interview questions, key documents, and then we split up an AUSA to an agent, and we just drove all over Phoenix for 3 or 4 days, knocking on doors, trying to talk to doctors, trying to talk to patients. You're trying to find people, you're trying to interview them, and you're trying to assess whether or not they're going to make good witnesses at trial. Because if they're not willing to be witnesses for your trial, they're not going to be good witnesses, they're of limited relevance and help you during your investigation. I led 3 different trips out to Arizona out there, and that's how we got our trial witnesses. That's how we found the woman who had suffered multiple miscarriages over the course of her life, was finally pregnant again, was very excited about it, took a Theranos HCG test. HCG is the pregnancy hormone, that told her she was miscarrying when in fact she wasn't. That's how we found a patient out there who had a blood test that told her she had HIV when she didn't. That's how we found a gentleman who had multiple Theranos PSA tests that told him his PSA was 25 when really his PSA was 2. And by the way, as an aside, it's not enough to show that the patient got an inaccurate Theranos test result. We wanted to show that it was one of the tests that they were running on their proprietary device. Because Theranos was doing so many things, right? Most of their tests was run on machines that they bought from other companies. Right? We're not trying to make a case against Siemens or Advia. They had their proprietary device, the Edison, that was only running between 6 and 12 tests. And then they also had these third-party devices that they were modifying, which all that means is they were printing something that was called a teacup that allowed them to use a smaller sample volume to run tests. They were running tests at a medium complexity lab in Arizona. They were running tests at a high complexity lab in California. Some weeks the test was down, some weeks it wasn't. So really, to pin all that down in that unwieldy database of relativity to try and establish the life of a test was really, really difficult to do. And I know I'm skipping ahead here, but this is the end result. So this is a slide that I put together for the HCG test for the closing of the Theranos trial for Holmes. And it gives the life of the HCG test at Theranos. And it's a summary of all the evidence, both testimonial and documents that we put into evidence in the trial. And basically, the point of the timelines is it shows that that test was validated in the lab in March. They started testing on it in May. About 3 weeks later, the laboratory director halts it because he has concerns. It's only offline for a little bit. Theranos puts it right back online. And now they start getting email customer complaints about the result. Holmes is on these email complaints, so she's aware that they're having problems with the HCG. They continue to offer it. Now the test is failing quality control in the lab, which we know is sort of the marker that tells you whether or not a device or test is working on a particular day. And then eventually, the patient receives an inaccurate test result. And in our case, that patient was a count in the indictment, and she was a witness at the trial. So we indicted the case the first time in June 2018. We did several superseding indictments. I think by September 2018, Theranos was no longer an entity. All their IP had been sold to a company called the Fortress Investment Group. And then almost 3 years later, on August 31st, 2021, Holmes went to trial. Her trial lasted 4 months. Balwani's lasted 3. And people that are perhaps less interested in the substantive issues of the trial than you folks are, ask me all the time, like, what was it like being out there for a trial that had so much media coverage? What was the vibe? In a word, it was very stressful. We were under a lot of pressure, whether it was at work or people we knew in our personal lives. People would constantly come up to you and go, "Oh, she's so guilty, you have to convict her." And I had lost the trial a couple years ago, so I was already in bad shape. So it was like a foregone conclusion in everybody's mind that she was going to get convicted. So that just sort of added to the pressure. Every day there at the courthouse was a complete media circus. So the courthouse was in San Jose, and there was a main courtroom, and then there was an overflow courtroom where they put the trial on closed caption television, and both were packed. So journalists and spectators that wanted to go in to the trial for the day would start lining up, and that's a picture of the line. They would start lining up at about 4 a.m. just to get a ticket to try and get into the main courtroom or the overflow courtroom. And when you were in court, you could always tell when a witness statement or a document really hit because you would just start hearing this crescendo of these journalists behind you typing on keyboards. And the judge was constantly admonishing them, threatening to close the courtroom because he claimed the jury was complaining that they couldn't hear the testimony. But it was nice reinforcement for you that something was really, really effective. One of the days in line, the day that Holmes testified, somebody in line was selling Elizabeth Holmes starter kits. We had this one investor who was completely uncontrollable, and as one of the FBI agents is walking in through court security to testify that day, he announces to the court security, "I'm here to put Elizabeth Holmes in prison." So the court security notifies the judge notifies the defense wants to question the FBI agent in front of the judge. That was a mess. The trial was occurring in the middle of COVID, so everybody in the courtroom had masks on except for the testifying witnesses, provided they were vaccinated, and most people were. But when somebody came up to the witness stand, they weren't vaccinated. It was noticeable because they either had to wear this huge, ridiculously looking clear face shield or like a screen marking themselves as not vaccinated. So really the only people that weren't vaccinated were our doctors and patients because they're from Arizona. And so they're marking themselves as anti-science when we're trying to convince the jury that they should be listening to these people's opinions on the scientific accuracy of the tests. So that was a little frustrating. One juror was kicked off the jury because she was playing Sudoku during witness testimony. We were losing jurors due to COVID infections. 2 months in, I was honestly more terrified of a mistrial and having to come back out a year later and do it again than I was of an acquittal, selfishly. Regarding investor fraud. So the government's theory of the case was that Theranos was running out of money, it had no revenue, it was burning through cash, so Holmes and Balwani made a conscious decision to recruit investors, which they did through the use of false financial projections, false statements about the technology being used in the military, and they disseminated these false statements through the media, through their website, and through investor advisors, and investors relied on those falsehoods and invested as a result. A key piece of evidence in this case was the projected financial statement that Holmes and Balwani disseminated to investors through the investor binders. The woman pictured here was Theranos' comptroller, and she was a government witness for us at trial. And what you're also seeing up here is a copy of that projected financial statement that was given to one of the investors, and that's the investor's handwritten notes on it. The thing to the far right is an excerpt from Ms. Yam's transcript. So this is one of the slides that I prepared for the closing, and a couple of key facts to help you put this document into context. In 2012, Theranos' revenue was 0. In 2013, their revenue was 0. Their deal to roll out the technology with Walgreens nationwide, which was going to be essentially the entire source of their revenue, was in a complete death spiral. They knew it. We proved it at trial. And they knew that at the time that they were still using these projections to court investors. And you'll see on the handwritten notes up at the top that says 900 locations. That's because they were telling investors, we're getting ready to roll out nationwide in 900 Walgreens locations. They knew that wasn't true at the time. They were at a cash burn rate of about $2 million a week. I think since the inception of Theranos through 2015, they lost $580 million. Yet, here's this projected statement of income where they are projecting for investors that in 2015, they're going to earn $1 billion. That's not reasonable. So the comptroller, Ms. Yam, she testified that she'd never seen this document, she didn't help prepare it, and it didn't match up with any of the internal financial projections that the company had. So there's 3 categories of fraud that we look for, right? Corruption, misappropriation of assets, and financial statements. So if a company had a functioning ethics and compliance program, wouldn't it have been likely that during a risk assessment, they might have identified inaccurate fraudulent financial statements as something to look out for? And wouldn't it be possible that they might have had an internal control to make sure that they weren't using unaudited financial statements with investors? I forgot to mention that. The company had no audited financial statements. They're giving unaudited financial statements to investors. And what creates the opportunity for fraud? Weak internal controls, lack of segregation of duties. So in this case, the same people that are creating these projections, Balwani and Holmes, are the ones giving them to investors. Lack of segregation of duties. So my favorite aspect of the fraud, Holmes and Balwani, were these VIP demos, technology demonstrations that they were doing for people. So they would invite VIPs and investors to come out to their offices, and they would walk them into a conference room, and there would be at least one, maybe several machines sitting in the conference room, and they would say, hey, how would you like to have your blood tested? And they'd be sure. So they'd prick their finger, they'd take a sample, they'd put it in the machine, and they'd hit a button, and the thing would light up and start making noises, and they would say, well, it'll be a while when we go finish the rest of the tour, and they would leave out the conference room. A couple things that were going on behind the scenes. First of all, most times the machines that were in the room that they were showing investors were like future generations of the machine that Theranos hoped would eventually work and they could use for testing. It was never the Edison device that could only do 6 to 12 tests. Also, they had loaded certain software programs on there called things like null protocols and dummy protocols and demo apps that essentially what would happen is when that's loaded on the machine and you hit the power button, it just flashes a bunch of lights and spins around. But it's telling the machine, don't run any tests. Don't show any errors. Just make it look like you're working. Holmes made sure those were always loaded on there. And then the third thing they were doing was as the investors and whoever was taking them on the tour left the building, a lab technician that would then come into the conference room, open up the machine, take the sample out, go to the bench, run the lab test on the bench, and then that's what they use to report back to the investors. So you get a report thinking that it's the machine that you just saw in there running it, and it had nothing to do with That was my favorite part of the fraud. I loved it every time you put in an email or something like that that showed that. The crux of the government's case, let's see. Any way to move this forward? Oh, there we go. Okay. The crux of the government's case regarding the fraud on patients and doctors was that Holmes and Balwani knew that Theranos technology was having problems, that the Theranos tests were inaccurate, that its devices were failing quality control, but they continued to offer the tests, they continued to make false statements about its capabilities and its accuracy, and that doctors and patients relied on those and then purchased the test. One of the government's first witnesses.
I want to use the right arrow key.
Yeah, I'm hitting that. There we go. One of the government's first witnesses was a laboratory director named Dr. Adam Rosendorf, and this poor guy was on the stand for 6 days. 2 days of direct, 4 days of cross, and redirect and recross. But for the 2 days we had him on direct, we were putting email after email in front of him showing that he was notifying Holmes and Balwani of problems that were in the lab. It was very, very damaging testimony. So after his testimony, our very next witness was Dr. Sunil Dewan. And you heard me reference him in my opening. That was the absentee lab director. He was Sunny Balwani's dermatologist. Sunny Balwani went to him and said, "Hey, how would you like a job that's not really going to require anything of you? How'd you like to be the lab director?" He said, "Sure." He didn't know anything about the company. Sunny didn't tell him anything. He had to Google it to find out what Theranos' technology was. Like I said, he never met with a doctor. He never met with a patient. He never met with a lab person. The only thing he was asked to do was, when Theranos was learned that FDA was coming to inspect them at the end of 2015, Balwani summoned him to the office, sat him in a conference room, put a stack of 300 SOPs in front of him, and told him to sign every single one of them, which he did. So that's the only thing he did. So the juxtaposition of having him testify right after this laboratory director that is causing all sorts of headaches by raising problems about the testing, it's hard to overstate the effectiveness of that. There was one other laboratory director that testified in this case. It was a pathologist from California. And Holmes hired him to come in and audit the high complexity lab after CMS had shut it down. So he came in, he looked at all the test results, and he had serious concerns that the test results on the Edison, their device, weren't accurate. One of the things that led him to that conclusion was he found multiple test results for females that returned positive results for prostate-specific antigen. So he eventually convinced her to void the test. So Theranos had to void 50,000 tests on the Edison. Every single patient test that they ran on that device, they had to send out notices to patients years later saying, "Hey, these tests are inaccurate." That doctor's name was Dr. Kingshuk Das, and he graduated from Case Western Reserve Medical School. I didn't remember that until 3 days ago. I shot up like in a bolt in bed, and I was like, "Kingshuk Das went to medical school in Case. I gotta put that in there." There's a lot of different stories told about Theranos. It's a story about greed. It's a story about privilege, the startup culture of fake it till you make it in Silicon Valley. But I think that it's also a story of really great courage and heroism. And I'm referring to the three whistleblowers in this case: Dr. Rosendorf, Erica Chung, and Tyler Schultz. And in the case of Tyler and Erica, they were fresh out of school, just starting their career. And to stand up to Holmes and Balwani at great risk to themselves and eventually great financial expense was really, really, I think, a story that I like to tell anytime I speak about this. You know, the expectations for the Department of Justice is that a company is going to have, you know, a culture in place where they encourage people to report misconduct, where they protect their anonymity, where they maintain their confidentiality, where they make sure they're free from retaliation. And DOJ isn't just looking to see if that's captured in some policy procedure. They're looking to see that it actually is part of the culture. And this is Erica Chung. I mentioned her. She was a lab associate, and she saw quality concerns with the tests that she was running for patients on their device, the Edison. She even tested her own blood on there and couldn't verify the results. And she raised those concerns directly to Sunny Balwani, the chief operating officer of Theranos. And what did he say to her? "What makes you think you're qualified to make that assessment? I'm tired of people trying to raise doubts about the Edison. Your only duty and responsibility is to process samples without question." She tried to raise those concerns internally, she was shut down. She tried to go to the board of directors, no avail. She eventually had to write an anonymous letter to CMS, which led to the inspection, which shut down their lab. So essentially, Theranos turned her into an external whistleblower, and it shut down their laboratory as a result. So we had all the text messages that Holmes and Balwani were sending to each other, or at least all the ones that the defense counsel produced, and they were a big part of this trial. And there was a period of time where Holmes and Balwani are trying desperately to find out who is the one that's cooperating with John CWRU from the Wall Street Journal. So instead of thinking, how can we encourage these employees to report their misconduct to us so we can mitigate it, this is a text message from Balwani to Holmes. Right, I'm narrowing this down in Kalia, that's the laboratory, down to 5 people. We'll nail this mother effer. That's what they thought of whistleblowers. One of the things that Erica Chung testified to was that when she left, there would be shadowy SUVs outside. She was getting threatening letters. She felt like she was being followed. These were 2 exhibits that we put into evidence in the Balwani trial. The top one, it says, this is a wire requested by Heather. We believe that's a reference to the general counsel, for Erica Chung and Tyler Schultz, an amount of $24,000. And then the second one is an entry for a David Fetchheimer for about $150,000 for Interfer. Does anybody know what Interfer is, or David Fetchheimer? No. He's a very famous private investigator out in San Francisco. He was involved in the Kobe Bryant litigation. He was involved in the Martha Stewart litigation. He's more affectionately known as Fetch. So we just put these in evidence. We didn't put any evidence or testimony as to what those payments were for, but you're free to draw your own conclusion now that you know who David Fetchheimer is. So at the end of the formal trial, Holmes was convicted of 4 of the 11 felony counts that she was charged with, and several months later, Balwani was convicted of all 12. She received over 11 years in prison. He received over 12. What was really frustrating for me as the FDA guy was that she was acquitted of all the patient counts. And I remember reading somewhere that one of the jurors said, we just didn't believe that she intended to hurt patients. I found that incredibly irritating because that's not what we were required to prove. But we clearly didn't do a good enough job. So I went back out. There was a couple-month break before the 2 trials. I went back out for the Balwani trial. We're in week 1 of the trial. We have the witness up that we used to put all the marking evidence to. And I said, I just don't think we did a good enough job, with the jury and the marking stuff. We got to make a finer point on that. We just have to prove that she made statements. She knew they were false. They relied on them. So the AUSA John Bostic, who's down in private practice, is just listening to me patiently and shaking his hand. And he's like, okay, it's Friday. We don't have court till Tuesday. Go find something I can use. So I went back to my hotel over the weekend, and I'm just in there digging through documents and things. And one of the greatest documents I found 2 years prior was this email from Theranos' general counsel. They had taken all the marketing claims they wanted to make, and they had sent them to a law firm and said, what do you think? And essentially the advice back was, you say X, you know that X isn't true, you should instead say Y. And Theranos disregarded all of it. So we were able to put in evidence that showed, hey, this is what they gave to the attorneys, this is what the attorney told them, this is what they put on the website, this is what was in Walgreens, and that's what you're seeing there. The top part is an excerpt from that email where they're getting the legal advice, and the bottom part is what was in either on their website or in Walgreens showing that they completely disregarded it. So these were in the closing as well. I think the elephant in the room here in any discussion of ethics and compliance is, where was the Theranos board of directors in all this? A company's board of directors, they're supposed to govern the company. They're supposed to be aware of a compliance and ethics program. They're supposed to make sure one is implemented. And there were a lot of famous people on this board of directors. You had Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. George Shultz, former Secretary of State. James Mad Dog Mattis, Secretary of Defense. Sam Nunn, Senator. Bill Frisch, Senator. The critique of the board's makeup, and I'm paraphrasing here, was that they had enough former government officials, military leaders, and political heavyweights to launch an invasion or run a small country, but they couldn't actually evaluate whether or not the Theranos technology worked, and that was true. And I think it was kind of foreseeable given their makeup. They didn't have the technological expertise, but how is it that they didn't have the insight that so many people were reporting misconduct internally? And I think that really points to how important it is to have an independent and empowered chief compliance office in a company with a dotted line report to the board or an audit committee on the board. At the time of the trials, I lived in Maryland with my wife and son, who was a freshman in high school. And for 7 out of 9 months, I lived in a hotel room in San Jose. It just wasn't feasible for me to come home and visit during that time because of how busy I was. And whenever I came home anyway, all I did was work. When I came home for Thanksgiving, I think I was home for 2 days. And one of the AUSAs, who's now a judge out in California, he calls me up. And he had done this many times over the 6 years. He would call up and be very excited about something. And he would use words like silver bullet and kill shot. So he calls me up, and the direct testimony of Holmes had wrapped up right before Thanksgiving. So when we came back, we were immediately going to start cross-examination. So he calls me, and he had this hunch that she was going to say that they decided to use those third-party analyzers way later than they actually did. And he said, if we can prove this, it will be devastating. So that's all I need to do here. I'm down for devastating. So for 2 days, me and the postal inspection agent, we're in there on Thanksgiving, laptop up, pulling documents, sending back and forth, and he's right. Like, this happened way earlier than we thought she would admit to. And at one point, my wife looks at me and she's like, why did you even come home? And I'm like, because Bob said this is going to win the trial. So we did this for 2 days. I fly back to California. Bob's got everyone was paralegal, has everything printed up in a binder, and he's going to hammer her with it. And he gets up to the podium and he starts, and he asks her, he said, Ms. Holmes, when did you first make the decision to use these third-party analyzers? And we thought she would say something like, 2015 or something, and not 2013. And she goes, 2013. And he just quietly closes the binder, picks it up, puts it under, pivots to a new line of question. And I'm sitting next to the postal guy on the bench, and I just turn to him and I go, 2 days is completely wasted. But it was tough. It was a big strain for my wife and child. And I will say for the 7 months I was out there, not one time did they make me feel bad about it. Did they try to put that on me, even though they were really suffering, especially my son. And I don't think I could have been. Well, I know I couldn't have been as focused as I was on the task at hand if they had put that on top of me. So I'm grateful for that. I think it's fair to say that 24 years of law enforcement, most of that spent investigating companies for ethical misconduct and fraud, has transformed what probably at one time was knowledgeable, informed skepticism into cynicism about the motives of companies when it comes to wanting to be ethical and wanting to be compliant. Within FDA, anytime somebody left FDA and then went to either work for a pharma company, we used to say that was going to work for the dark side. And the presumption being that you have to put aside your integrity and values to make up for the wage gap that you worked in the government all those years. But I would say recently, in the last year, I've met good people inside the industry, and I've tried to educate myself more about the field of ethics and compliance. I'm not an expert in ethics and compliance, and what I've seen and what I've learned is that there is this space, and it is growing. Theo and I talked about that earlier. For professionals that really want to dedicate themselves to helping companies be ethical compliant. And I've started to see the parallels between what that profession does and what I did as an investigator. And that's why I started my company. I read somewhere where in the corporate context, a lawyer will tell a company what they can do, but a compliance officer will tell them what they should do, and a business needs to hear both perspectives. So for those of you in this room considering a career in this field that are positioned to provide both perspectives, what an advantage to you and what an asset to any organization that employs you. So I wish you luck. I can't imagine that any institution could better prepare you than the Case Western Reserve University Law School. And I'll thank you in advance for the work that you're going to do to make sure that our businesses that create our products and provide our services act with integrity, act with commitment, and act with transparency. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. And if you want to call on people, George, that'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you. I just had a quick question about, I'm assuming investors may have been on their own, had their own corporations. Were they actually using proper due diligence? And had they been, would they have invested?
That is a terrific question. So, I would say that was part of the defense, right? That this was a business failure, and it was caused by the lack of due diligence by the investors. My personal opinion from what I saw was there was a lot of FOMO going on with the investors. It was, I mean, you know, right? If you want to really get rich on an investment, you have to get in early when you don't know whether or not it's going to work out, and you're probably willing to accept a certain level of risk. So I think the due diligence could certainly be questioned. The only rebuttal I would have to the defense is certainly that doesn't mitigate intentional falsehoods and fraudulent statements made to investors. But yes, I think you might be disappointed if you saw the due diligence on the part of the investors. And I think part of it was when you start getting into these families like the Waltons and the Murdochs that are investing $100 million a pop. And by the way, none of these investors were upset that they lost their investment. That tells you what $100 million is to them. They didn't want to cooperate with us. They didn't want to. It was gone. It's almost like they find out that the other people are investing $100 million. They're like, okay, yeah, I'm in. That's the due diligence.
So they didn't get any, like a derivative suit or get in trouble from their companies?
There was one derivative suit from, I think it was a company called PFM, Partners Financial. They did sue, but there was really nothing for them to get. Theranos revenue was all gone. Their IP, which is, in my opinion, worthless, was all owned by Fortress, so there was really nothing for them to get. But there was one lawsuit.
Hey, George, how did you get in the advice from Hyman Phillips?
Great question.
That's a law firm, and you're going to them and you're saying, look at our stuff, so it's privileged. So tell the students how you cracked that nut.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I mentioned in September 2018, Theranos no longer existed as a company. So basically, they had used all their IP as collateral to get a loan from Fortress Investment Group. Eventually, Fortress Investment Group owned everything when Theranos completely folded. So Jim's right? How is that not a privileged email? Why does the government have it? So anytime we got something like that, remember, when they're getting that legal advice, that's the legal advice for Theranos. That's not Elizabeth Holmes' attorneys. That's not her legal privilege. We would just go to Fortress Group and say, hey, would you mind waiving the privilege for this email that you don't care anything about and have nothing to do with? And they're like, yeah, sure, we'll waive privilege. And so otherwise, we probably wouldn't have been able to use that email.
And I have one more for you. Did you make anybody else plead? Or did you just give all those folks immunity? Did anybody else have to?
Nobody got immunity. Nobody else pled.
Just those two.
There were only two charged. There were certainly discussions about charging others, but we ultimately just charged them. Nobody else got immunity. But boy, there were some tough pills to swallow. People that you're interviewing, and you're like, oh, I really want to charge this person. They're not being truthful, but yeah.
I feel like Theranos is a great example of where like Silicon Valley and like you said, life sciences, and it feels like in part the reason why Theranos blew up the way that it did was because of Silicon Valley culture, arguably. And so I feel like in today, you, especially in your current work, how do you balance advising companies who really, because I feel like what's, you know, everyone wants to make a lot of money, everyone loves marketing and hype, but how do you actually, you know, convince them to still feel like that they're still pushing forward and can bring value while also still maintaining this compliance? Because I feel like they decided to do away with the ethics part because of the profits were just too great, the opportunity was too great.
Yeah, I think part of it is you have to cite these examples, to especially when, you know, these startups are operating in a highly regulated space. And these aren't, this isn't, you know, somebody selling tennis shoes or shit, right? It's, you know, it's regulated by the FDA and it's regulated by CLIA. So I think it's pointing to these examples and really sort of trying to impress upon those C-suite and executives and the board of directors that the FDA and CMS takes products in this space very seriously. If you're dealing with the safety and the efficacy and you're involving patients, those are big, complex regulatory risks. And I think the only way you can really drive that home is say the consequences for ignoring that are real. Look at cases like Theranos, and then just keep hammering that home.
And to follow up on that, considering the current administration and some of the, some people who are not as interested in regulating or doing things in a very ethical way, how would you say in this current environment does that affect your work?
Yeah, so hard to say. Doesn't affect my work because I'm not in the government anymore. But I do think, under the last administration, there was a memorandum. I think it was called I think it was after Lisa Monaco, and she was at DOJ, and it basically said, hey, we're going to prioritize targeting corporate executives that do wrongdoing. And my understanding is that has been removed. So my guess is with this administration, there's going to be less zeal in targeting executives of companies, and I think we can all see there's probably going to be a relaxed regulatory environment. But I'm confident, having worked so long at FDA, that if you're dealing with the safety and the health of people, and somebody gets hurt or, God forbid, dies because of a product or a device, I don't think anybody's going to take them for that. And if you can prove that executives knew that, should have stopped it, I have every confidence that DOJ would support that prosecution and everything would proceed as it normally would. That's my hope and that's my expectation.
If the relativity system was so disorganized and difficult to use that even today, we're sure there are documents that exist that you should have introduced at trial but couldn't find them, why did you continue to use it? Why not replace it or fix it, or why continue to use a useless system?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it's useless. For all I know, it might be the best system that's on the market. I think that's something probably where AI, when that gets embraced more by the government, and as you know, the government is slow to embrace technology, is something that will improve it. But even to this day, I'm working as a litigation consultant for U.S. Attorney's Office. I have 2 relativity accounts on cases. I'm using relativity. It's no different than it was 5 years ago. So is it a government contracting issue? I don't know. Is it the best product on the market? I don't know. But it's what the government uses. I don't know the answer to that.
So I know you said you were pretty disappointed that she was acquitted on all of the patient-related charges, and there was a lot in the media about how her image kind of was molded after Steve Jobs, and then at trial it kind of shifted. She had had children at that point, or was pregnant, was perceived more as like maternal. So it kind of seems like she went from like Steve Jobs to portraying herself as like Mother Teresa. I'm wondering if you think that that had anything to do with that juror saying they just didn't think that she intended to harm, or if you think that had any bearing.
All the things you pointed out were true. Those things did happen. I think it was more. There were a lot of smart, hardworking people at Theranos that were really trying to make this technology work. And in a lot of those email chains, the same email chains where it's clear that she's being notified that there's problems with the test, they're also discussing how do we fix this, right? What can we do? How can we fix it? So I really think it was more the jury focused on the fact that they were trying to fix everything. They weren't like, well, who cares if it's not working? We're making money. Like we see email after email, and the defense did a good job pointing it out, where they're trying to solve the problems, they're trying to fix them, and I think it was more like that. But I think we probably could have done a better job saying, yeah, we're not saying she intended to hurt anybody. She said that this technology is second to none, that it is the most accurate thing in the world. It can do this. And she knew that it wasn't true, and she said it anyway. But yeah, I think it was more the email evidence that showed how hard they were working to try to fix the things in the lab, in my opinion.
I just want to say thank you for the time you put into this, the sacrifice you made. But also, what do you think accounts for the difference between the sentences? So Holmes gets a shorter sentence than Balwani. Is there, it sounds like she was in charge, but yeah.
Well, I think you had to give Balwani a little longer sentence because he got convicted of all counts. And she was acquitted of 3 investor counts. She was acquitted of all the patient counts. So I think that's the difference. I was actually kind of surprised. Well, we were all pretty surprised that she got 11 years in prison. So
yeah.
we kind of thought there would be a bigger disparity.
Yeah.
But I think because he got convicted of all the counts, and especially the patient counts, he was going to get at least a little more time than she did. In the back.
Could you talk a bit more about the decision not to charge others? I know that there had been a lot of discussion about why wasn't Daniel Young charged and some of the other people, so I'm just curious if you had any insight about that.
Well, I want to be careful there. You always want to get the most responsible actors. You always want to get the people that profited the most. Those are factors. You want to get the people where it's sort of the best, the most clean evidence.